Good Yontif. On a Friday in August, 530 years ago, 3 ships set sail from Spain carrying about 90 men. According to the onboard log of the captain, a lookout spotted land on the morning of October 12th, 1492. And all of us know this narrative. Yet if we think about this voyage at all, we probably think about pieces of the story that are at best inaccurate and at worst simply false. The captain was not named Columbus. Perhaps he was named Colombo, perhaps Cologne. He wasn't Spanish. He was an Italian from Genoa. He never landed on the mainland of North America. He did land on several Caribbean islands, and to quickly dispense with a canard, probably the biggest misconception that Jews could invent, he wasn't Jewish. This theory has been definitively debunked in a 1992 essay written by one of the greatest historians of American Jewish history, Dr. Jonathan Sarna. It is likely, however, that his interpreter, Luis del Torres, was a converso, a Jew who forcibly converted to Catholicism. I first offered a Holy Day sermon with some of this information 30 years ago in honor of the 500th anniversary of Columbus's fateful voyage. And the point of that sermon was to put forth what has been a central animating idea of my rabbinate for the past 30 years. That at the time, after 500 years in the New World, we knew that America was the land of milk and honey for Jews. And on this, 30 years later, the 530th anniversary of this voyage, I want to reflect upon what has changed in the intervening 3 decades. Everything has changed. Precisely because our world has changed so drastically, I once again want to address this crucial question. Is America still the land of milk and honey for Jews? And I'm going to do something I haven't done at Temple Judea. This is my 10th Holy Day with you. I'm going to give a 2-part sermon. So this sermon and my sermon on Yom Kippur Day will answer this question. Now, my sermon of 30 years ago wasn't remotely controversial. No one suggested I had the facts wrong. No one mentioned that I left out any mention of Native Americans or African Americans or women. Today, it's hard to listen to that narrative in the same way. Today, the mere mention of Columbus's name triggers a strong response. In the intervening 30 years since I gave that sermon, dozens of American cities and 10 states, not California, have opted out of Columbus Day completely. Los Angeles as a city has. Now, when I was in grade school, I learned about Columbus. I learned about his voyage, the voyages of other European explorers, about Jamestown, and of course, the Pilgrims. And when I talked about these lessons with my parents, really with anybody, no one suggested the history was wrong, let alone incomplete. We learned something about Native Americans, but only in the most superficial way. We learned almost nothing really about slavery except for what the curriculum felt were the highlights: Harriet Tubman, the Underground Railroad. And not coincidentally, these are narratives that pretty much gloss over the horrors of slavery. In my own school experience, we didn't learn one single thing about Jews in America in a high school that was 40% Jewish. Learning about Jews in America was not part of the public school curriculum in any way, shape, or form. I learned about the Jewish experience in America in religious school. We didn't learn really about women in U.S. history except for Betsy Ross, Dolly Madison, and a few others. 30 years ago, leaving out virtually everyone from the founding story of America was not remarkable. 30 years later, it doesn't feel good. What has changed is that today there is almost nothing that isn't seen through the prism of what we call identity politics. And in this first sermon, I will focus on the ways in which identity politics is shaping America for better or for worse. And as you were listening, bear in mind the central question I'm addressing. Is this good for the Jews? Is America still the land of milk and honey for the Jews? And I would ask, before you totally disagree with what I'm saying, at least listen to both sermons and then totally disagree. Identity politics is crucial to understanding a central question, perhaps the central question that we confront today. What is America? Is America a land founded on the premise that all men are created equal? Is America a land founded upon the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? What of freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of speech? What about the idea that anybody can rise up from nothing and be a success? Or is America a country whose history is rooted in the genocide of Native Americans, the enslavement of African Americans, the subjugation of women, and xenophobia toward the many groups of immigrants that flooded our shores? As recently as 1992, when I gave that first sermon, these questions were at best whispered, if that. But in 2022, the whispers have given way to strident demands of groups that comprise the United States to be properly recognized in the 246-year narrative of America. I happen to believe that it's altogether fitting and appropriate that the narrative of this great country allow the greatest number of its citizens to feel included. What is the authentic American narrative? What we consider to be the authentic American narrative is the narrative of the Pilgrims, the stories of Native Americans and the first settlers breaking bread together, the Boston Tea Party, the revolt against England. This version of the authentic American narrative, we must admit, is the narrative of the white European settlement of America, and specifically, and this is important, it's the narrative of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America. And this is an important point because virtually every person in this room of any age, formally and informally, learned a very specific narrative of America. The narrative isn't wrong, but it is far from complete. It's not the full story. The white Anglo-Saxon Protestant narrative is not an authentic American narrative for Black Americans or Native Americans or Asian Americans or Italians, Germans, Irish, Eastern European, and Russian Americans, for women, for the LGBT plus community, and importantly, for the Jewish community. Many among the groups I just mentioned feel that that American history has been dominated by the narrative of white European settlement. And they feel, I think with good reason, that they deserve a larger piece of the narrative. They are kind of done with having their children make pilgrim costumes for Thanksgiving. What we've understood as the authentic American narrative is as complicated for Jews as it is for any of the groups I've mentioned. As merely one example, I think most of us know the well-documented narrative of America's response to the Holocaust. The eminent historian David Wyman conclusively proved that the Roosevelt administration made deliberate decisions to reject most Jewish immigrants and to reject plans to bomb railway lines that would have saved hundreds of thousands of Jews. But we Jews, we don't really like to dwell on this part of American Jewish history. We do like to talk about how great Roosevelt was. But if you really get down to it, neither America nor Franklin Roosevelt cared much about Jews during World War II. There is no authentic American narrative. The narratives that have come down to us for these many centuries are embellishments of events. They're selective recounting of events and outright fictional creations built upon the faintest shred of fact. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's great poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, I'm sure all of you can recite the opening line of this poem. Well, it contains numerous deliberate inaccuracies, Longfellow admitted this at the time of its writing, and that's because, by his own admission, Longfellow wrote the poem not as history, but as creative narrative, to create a specific American legend that resonated with like-minded abolitionists on the eve of the Civil War. The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere is actually a polemic and a call to arms against slavery. It has nothing to do with the Revolutionary War. Yet when we teach this poem in schools, we use it to highlight the courage of the colonists. We rarely teach the poem in the context of the Civil War. The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere is a narrative like so many we've created, built upon the thinnest thread of fact, and the narrative overtakes the fact until we no longer recognize the difference. So when we hear leaders of the black community calling for a more robust teaching of the history of slavery in America, and we think that this is merely politics, let us realize this, that black leaders are simply doing what white European Anglo-Saxon Protestants have been doing for centuries. The same is true for women or for Asians. Pick your group. All of these groups do have an authentic American narrative. It's just not the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant narrative that we've learned since the founding of this country. And we must acknowledge, in fact, that every group, every nation, every religion, every family, every individual, all create narratives. This has been going on since the beginning of time, and our people, the Jewish people, we are leaders in the field of creating narratives. The parting of the Red Sea, unlikely. Joshua and the walls of Jericho, fictional. Solomon threatening to divide a baby in half, not true. As I've preached many times, this doesn't mean these narratives aren't vitally important to our cultural identity. It doesn't mean they don't underscore some part of Jewish identity that is important, and I have no plan to stop teaching these narratives. It does mean, however, that we have to understand these narratives are created to define who we are as a people and what we believe in. And what this also means is that we need to allow other groups of people to create their own narratives, even when those narratives threaten ours. To take but one example, the African American community is correct in wanting the narrative of slavery to be more prominent in the American narrative. One doesn't need to be a professor of history to know that slavery has been one of the major issues in this country since its founding. Grappling with it and teaching it doesn't undermine the American narrative written by white Europeans. It strengthens that narrative. The time is long past to reckon with our treatment of African Americans, the narrative of women, the narrative of Asians in this country, the LGBT plus community, and any other community that has not been included in the American narrative. Earlier in this sermon, I asked rhetorically, what is America? Is America a land founded on the premise that all men are created equal, or is America a country whose history is rooted in the genocide of Native Americans, or the enslavement of African Americans, or the subjugation of women, or xenophobia toward the many groups of migrants that flooded our shores? And the answer, of course, is that America is all these things. We Jews have created our own American narrative that accentuates the positive. We don't spend a lot of time recounting the part of the Jewish American narrative that's about religious tests to seek public office, or that's about the covenant that restricted communities had to keep Jews out, or the active efforts of Ivy League schools to keep Jewish enrollment as low as possible, or Father Coughlin. I could go on and on and on. We Jews like to emphasize the narrative of the great Jewish American success story across the board. But other groups do not feel this way. And I think it's much harder for the black community to accentuate the positive, so to speak. I think the idea borders on the ridiculous, actually. I fully support the black community in their efforts to advance a more robust narrative that comports with their actual lived experience in this country. And I feel the same way about women and Asians and every other group you can think of. I believe that ultimately, a more robust reckoning with the narratives of all these groups will be better for America. With all of this said, I still believe that when a full accounting of all of this is complete, and when the ledger balances the good things in America against the bad things in America, we will conclude unequivocally that the world is much better today because of America. And yet, even as I tell you that including diverse narratives into the American narrative is a good thing, even as I tell you that our country will be strengthened by it, even when I tell you on balance we are better off for the American experience, I'm left with a little pebble in my shoe, as it were, a question that gnaws at me, that irritates me. Is it good for the Jews? If you come on Yom Kippur morning, you can hear the answer. Shana Tova.